Dear comrades and friends, it's an honour to be invited to address the STUC Congress, my first Congress as leader of the Scottish Labour Party. I just wish I was able to join you in person. I know these are really difficult times for us all across the country, so hope you and your loved ones are keeping safe. And a particular thank you to all those that have continued to work on our front line for going above and beyond and helping us get through this crisis. And the biggest thank you we can make to you is by making sure we not just applaud you, not just recognise you, but actually reward you appropriately coming through this pandemic and reshaping our economy and our public services and our society for future generations. I want to say a thank you to both Ros Foye, the General Secretary, and Mary Senior for their tireless work over this most difficult of years. And also a thank you to them for being such a huge inspiration to leading women in our country, to leading women taking our trade union movement to much greater and bigger things. And it's an honour to be able to work with you both and indeed all across the Congress. This last year has been so difficult, as I say, for people across the country, and the importance of trade unions and the importance of trade union membership has been there for everyone to see. So thank you not only to each of you as individuals who've been on the front line, but thank you to all the trade union reps who have also been on the front line supporting their workforces. And you've seen just in recent days why that is so important. Just take one example. Actually, two examples I'll give you. One is the fire and rehire policy of British Gas decimating a whole sector, decimating the rights of workers, something that is absolutely shameful and should be a lesson for us coming through this pandemic. But also for those that were represented, for example, care workers who up until only recent weeks started getting fair testing in their workplaces, fair testing before for those home carers in particular. Again, a whole workforce that felt let down and felt like they were the victims of this pandemic. We have got to support them and reward them going forward. I particularly support the People's Recovery Document, which is at the heart of your Congress, which identifies so much of what our country needs to do in the coming years, and has helped shape our own thinking in this election campaign, and helped shape our manifesto in this election campaign as well. And I think you're right, we have to acknowledge that we can't go back to the way things were pre-COVID. People talk about going back to pre-COVID levels, people talk about build back better. They're not phrases that, to be honest, I really like. We've got to recognise that we had deep entrenched inequality pre-COVID, and those deep and entrenched inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID. That's why we've got to start again. We've got to build a new economic model that puts fairness at its heart. We've got to build a fairer and more diverse system to support not just our economy, but also our wider public services, so that we can collectively focus on a national recovery and come through this crisis as a fairer and stronger nation. And I always think about these things in a few different parts. For example, in our economy, how do we properly pay and reward those in the front line? How do we make sure we give a proper and fair pay rise to public sector workers across the country, not just to NHS staff, although I know there's challenges on NHS pay just now, also to social care staff, them being offered a derisory 20 pence increase is frankly not acceptable. But actually other frontline workers as well, for example, police officers, for example, local government workers, and all other public sector workers across the country who have kept our country going and who so often have been paid so poorly pre-COVID, but also during the COVID period as well. That's why I want to work with all of our trade unions to make sure we have adequate representation and adequate reward as we come through this pandemic. We also have got to make sure, particularly for our care workers, we made a pledge of £12 an hour starting wage, which over the course of the next Parliament goes up to £15 an hour. I want us to look at going beyond what has been promised for public sector workers in the round, so we can drive up pay and conditions, because that's fundamentally how we will tackle inequality and injustice as a result. So let's get more ambitious on what we do in our public sector. Let's get more ambitious about how we drive change also in the voluntary sector and the private sector. And a lot of the models that we have been talking about, for example, the 1.2 billion investment we want to do in the largest job creation scheme in the history of the Scottish Parliament. That also alongside it has Good Business Scotland, which makes a commitment that any business across Scotland that is reliant on any public funds has to meet basic conditions around pay, around trade union representation, around conditions, but also having a climate reduction plan as well, so we can make sure we're challenging the climate emergency. Beyond our economy, we've all been talking about a national care service. I'm pleased that the Scottish Government is now talking about a national care service, but it's got to be a national care service the way we consider it to be a national care service, not a national care service in name alone. That means putting dignity at the heart of our care service. It means putting quality of service at the heart of our care service. It means putting human rights at the heart of our care service, not profits. It means properly rewarding social care staff. It means making sure that there are no charges for people, non-residential charges for people that require on a care service, and to make sure that every family gets the justice they deserve. Too many families felt let down through this pandemic, and one of the biggest failures through this pandemic, I think, has been the response in our care homes. And just on that again, can I take the opportunity to thank those trade unions, the GMB, Unison and Unite and others who have been involved in making this top of our political agenda over the last year, a national care service. But as I say again, we've got to make sure it's not just a national care service in name, it must be a national care service in terms of how it delivers services for people across the country. Services based on quality of service, not on profit. And again, wider in terms of the jobs market, the reality is we face a potential jobs crisis coming through this pandemic. And I don't want us to have a generation of young people who lose their jobs coming through this pandemic. I don't want us to have lots of businesses closing across the country and seeing a spike in unemployment across the country as well. That's why we've got to make sure we have an ambitious plan around jobs. That's why we've unveiled our jobs recovery plan, which is partly around a guaranteed job for young people. It's also about a guaranteed job for the long-term unemployed. It's about a Scottish skills benefit, so everyone that is on furlough across the country has access to £500 worth of skills budget that they can draw down in order to learn new skills if they need to go and learn a new job. Also, that same skills benefit going to people that are long-term unemployed, so they can get paid for their training to go and get that support. We want to supplement that training as well for the long-term unemployed. For those that are on, for example, universal credit, which is far too low, they don't have the benefit of a furlough payment, but they're still going to be asked to go and do skills training. We think that should be paid training, so people are earning at least a living wage for them to be able to go get that level of skills training, hopefully learn that skill, go on and get a job, contribute to the wider tax base, and also help lift families out of poverty. And again, how we use procurement is going to be so important in that, and how we help to outlaw 0 hours contracts and make sure we are teaching best practice for the country going forward. I also want us to recognise that we can't go back to the old arguments. We've got to recognise that this isn't an ordinary election. These aren't ordinary times. 10,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their lives through this pandemic. 360,000 of our fellow citizens are on furlough, worried about if and when they'll have a job to go back to. We've got 7,000 undiagnosed cancer cases across the country. There are 1,500 children waiting over a year to get access to the mental health support. On 25,000 occasions, someone has picked up the phone, built up the courage, phoned a crisis mental health helpline, and the call has gone unanswered. That demonstrates that this election and the next parliament can't go back to the old arguments. It can't go back to egos. It can't be about personalities. It can't be about settling scores. It has to be about focusing on a national recovery that brings our country together, that focuses on what unites us as a country, not what divides us, and puts that national recovery front and centre. And that's what will be my determination in the next parliament, and the Labour Party's determination in the next parliament as well. Alongside that, that's not to say that the devolution journey is complete. If we are to have a recovery that works for everyone, it's got to be a recovery that is north, south, east, west, urban, rural, coastal, island communities. But to make a recovery work for everyone, we've got to push power and resource out from our parliaments into the nations and regions. So that means pushing power out from Westminster to the nations and regions of the UK, but it also crucially means pushing power out from Holyrood to local communities across Scotland as well. Economic levers, economic budgets, and alongside that devolution, I want us to look at devolving employment law, so we have a base and a floor across the UK, and we instigate a race to the top across the nations and regions, so we can be the gold standards on workers' rights here in Scotland, and also encourage that across the rest of the UK too. So that's what the national recovery means to me. A national recovery means to me that we harness the hope and optimism that we've got in the last couple of months coming through COVID. We recognise that while we were separated from our families like never before, we actually came together as a country like never before to help us get through COVID. And I don't want us to come through that collective trauma of COVID and go back to those old arguments or go back to that failed system of the past. I want us to recognize that COVID has changed the world, COVID has changed Scotland, and our politics and what we do with our parliament fundamentally has to change too. That's what our collective national mission must be, not going back to those old arguments. And I've said to people that I don't pretend to have all the answers and all the big questions, but I know collectively in our wider movement, we do have the collective answers, and we can work together to build a fairer and stronger Scotland for everyone. A fairer and stronger Scotland than went into lockdown last year coming through this pandemic. And I look forward to working with each and every single one of you in the coming days, weeks, months, and years to make that reality, so we can actually put all those values that we hold so dear, those values of solidarity, those values of equality, those values of social justice, those values of fairness, we can put them at the heart of our politics again and create the kind of society that we'll be proud to bring up our children in and be proud to grow old in ourselves. Let's build that Scotland that we'd like to see together. I can't wait to join you in person at some point in the very near future. Thank you so much for having us along today. Take care, everybody.